the North American economy was a barter economy. So the fact that silver dollars were available from Cuba, Havana, 60 miles south of Florida, was a huge thing. And not only that, is that Cuba was the biggest colonial military outpost because every convoy that came with silver from Mexico to Spain stopped in Havana. And Havana was a fortified town. It, in fact, had the only major shipyard in the Caribbean. No other country had a shipyard that built ships of the line and other military ships.
You are listening to Historyman, the platform for historians, curators, and authors to tell their stories of the American Revolution, walk in the footsteps of heroes, and proclaim freedom reigns. On today's episode, we're with author James Giesler. James has a law degree from the University of Exeter and a master's in American Studies at the University of Seville. And he's the author of a new book, Francisco de Saavedra. Did I get it right?
Francisco de Saavedra's American Revolutionary War.
American Revolutionary War. So welcome, James. Thank you for being on Historyman podcast. James, we had an episode recently by Harold Gonzalez in the American Revolution, especially down in the Gulf of America, they call it now, with the Gulf of Mexico. Your book is about another Spanish hero of that time. Tell us how you came about writing this book, and a little bit about the hero and how we can get the book.
Yeah. So the person you just mentioned, which I think is actually Galvez, General Galvez. So he was involved in the recapture of Pensacola, which had been taken by the British in the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War for you guys in America. And he had been sent there by the Minister of the Indies, who was in Madrid, and he ran all Spain's colonies. Galvez was also the nephew of the minister. So what happens is that Galvez is having a hard time from the junta, the Havana War Council, and because he was a young guy and the rest of the generals were jealous there. So the minister, the uncle, sends Francisco de Saavedra, who had been introduced into service in the colonial ministry because he was a great friend of Bernardo de Galvez. So what you would get here would be the coming together of two great friends. And Galvez would be, let's say, the more military guy in the front type of man. And Saavedra would be the guy in the background, the guy organizing the money, the logistics, to make sure that commanders agreed, to make sure that everybody was there on time. So that was Saavedra's magic, because up until the time that Saavedra arrived in Havana in January 1781, the French and the Spanish with the Spanish campaigns were in absolute chaos. So he comes into Havana and organizes the logistics and the getting together of all the commanders. That was the essence of his mission.
That's fantastic. And we don't talk a lot about the minutiae or the machinations behind the scene. We have these armies going all over the world, far-flung places. When we talk about the British Empire, we talk about the Spanish Empire, and we talk about French who are trying to maintain their empire. We don't talk about, and the Americans, for instance, we don't talk about the economies that needed to go with it. How do you pay these soldiers? How do you keep the war effort afloat? And certainly the war effort from an economic standpoint was in disarray here in America at the time, correct?
Correct. And actually, just in January 1781, which is when Saavedra arrives in Havana, over in the Pennsylvania line, George Washington is facing a mutiny. There were mutinous Continental Army soldiers wanting to go home, wanting to leave their posts, and several were actually executed. Many soldiers, in fact, the vast majority of the Continental Army had gone unpaid during the previous 7 years of the war, and the army were getting frayed, let's say, as the best description one can give it. So not only was there disarray amongst the Spanish and the French, there was beginnings of weakness within the Continental Army and the American efforts to shake off the British. It had been a long, stagnating war, and resistance was the best that could be offered. There was no victory in sight, including right through the year 1781, when eventually when the armies did get to start to march towards Yorktown, there were also mutinies in Philadelphia on the way down from New York amongst Continental Army soldiers. So pay and money and structure and agreement were the key things that came together in 1781 to make the great victory at Yorktown that made the British give up their effort to keep North America.
It's interesting. We had talked to one of our podcast guests, Schweikert. Schweikert talked about the miracles of the Revolutionary War and how at Yorktown the French, in one of the only times that the French defeated the British in naval warfare, that was at Yorktown. But that would not have happened had it not been for the Spanish and their coming alongside the French and the Americans in that way. Tell us a little bit about that cooperation between the French and the Spanish to make Yorktown happen.
Yes, so again, up until 1781, the Spanish and French coordination in the Caribbean had been lacking. They had supposed to be cooperating on several fronts, including, let's say, making an attack on Jamaica, which was one of the Spanish objectives agreed with the French at the beginning of the war, but nothing had essentially happened. So what happens when Saavedra arrives in Havana in January 1781? He gets the Spanish to agree amongst themselves, but secondly, and also very importantly, there's a French naval detachment in Havana's harbour, 4 ships of the line, and 2 frigates and three cutters. They would bolster the Spanish Navy, who had 17 ships of the line. Ships of the line are the largest ships available. They have between 17 and 100 cannons on board. There's nothing bigger at the time. It's like that age's aircraft carrier. It's the big one. So there were a lot of naval assets, but they weren't being used. So what Saavedra does is he makes a pact, almost in secret, with the French commander, a guy called the Chevalier de Monte, and they start to prod the Spanish Navy, which was less aggressive than the French Navy, into becoming more active. They all get together and eventually help Galvez to take Pensacola. So Galvez, who had taken Pensacola, would not have been able to do it without the background help, logistical help of the rest of the commanders, including the Spanish, the French, and Saavedra's prodding of all the commanders to come together. Now, in that coming together with the French, an important seed was sown, because when the Pensacola campaign was over in May 1781, Saavedra was instructed to go to the French colony of Saint-Domingue, which is modern-day Haiti. That was the biggest sugar plantation in the Caribbean, and as such was the place where he would meet a French fleet coming out of France under Admiral de Grasse, who'd be the naval commander at the Battle of the Chesapeake near Yorktown a few months later. With de Grasse, Saavedra organizes a campaign plan for the next 9 months. It involved getting the French fleet out of the Caribbean during the summer months, which is the hurricane season, and it's very dangerous to keep a fleet in the Caribbean during that time. They'll just be smashed on the rocks by whatever hurricane happens to come along. And this fleet would again double back down to the Caribbean from the late autumn, early to late autumn, back to do campaigning in the Caribbean. But from July 1780 to July 1781 to autumn 1781, this fleet was going to be the fleet that went to North America. De Grasse had no money, and money was needed. In fact, when de Grasse arrives in Saint-Domingue, he says to Saavedra, look, I don't have any money. I don't have money to kit out my ships. I don't have money for provisions on my ships. And the planters here in Saint-Domingue, they don't want to give me any money. I've been told by Paris that I can get money in this French colony, the richest sugar colony in the Caribbean, but no one's going to give me a cent. So Saavedra volunteers to go to Havana. And when he goes to Havana, he raises $500,000 silver dollars in the space of an afternoon, and has it shipped aboard the French fleet, which has sailed northwards to him. We're now talking early August 1781. The fleet carries on into the Florida Straits and up eventually to reach the mouth of the Chesapeake, where it discovers that the British are not there. The British fleet is in fact sailed in parallel and ended up in New York 5 days earlier. So there's no French fleet to defend the British army that was at Yorktown, basically between the James and the York rivers on a peninsula there, waiting to be surrounded, let's say, by anyone that came along. And so the French fleet arrived. Not only didn't have extra manpower because they'd bought an extra 3,500 regular troops from the French army, they had $500,000 on board. And this combined with the French army and the Continental Army that had marched down from New York under Washington and Rochambeau, and also the army that was waiting for them at Williamsburg under Lafayette, they all got together and an 18,000 man army eventually surrounded 7,500 British regulars at Yorktown.
So, James, you live in Spain right now. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, what made you think about writing a book about the American Revolution? What do you hope people will gain out of this?
Well, I started studying Saavedra when I was doing this master's degree that you mentioned that I completed at Seville University. It was the year of 2014 when actually his best friend Galvez, Congress had voted to put his portrait up in the Capitol where it hangs today. An act that was supposed to have taken place in 1783, but took another couple of hundred years to happen. And so everyone was very excited in Spain about this. And when I started reading books about Galvez, I realized that perhaps this guy called Saavedra should have been behind Galvez in the portrait, smiling and giving us a little wink, saying, I'm the guy that organized this.
What a great story of history. That is fantastic. So, just real quickly before we get on to the rest of your episode here, how would people find your book?
It's on Amazon, Francisco de Saavedra's American Revolutionary War. It's also available through all the main book stores in North America. It's distributed by Ingram Spark, and so it's available at bookstores. It can be ordered if not there.
You've mentioned very good. You've mentioned Havana several times. It sounds like Cuba and the Spanish played a significant role here. What is important that we learn and understand about the true contributions of the Spanish and the American victory at Yorktown and the Revolution? I know we talked about the portrait and everything, but what is significant or important that we learn altogether in your mind?
In my mind is that the American Revolution in America is studied very much from an onshore, a within America mindset. But in fact, the North American Revolution was part of a global war fought between four main European powers alongside the American rebels. So there were the UK, France, Spain, and the Netherlands. So this global war was all over the place. And what happened when the French and the Spanish came in is that they weakened by attacking Britain in Gibraltar and also in the Caribbean. They weakened it and made it unable to concentrate its entire Royal Navy on the North American coast, and also from concentrating its entire army within the North American colonies. This was the first weakening. Secondly, once the naval sea power had been wrested from Britain, the French and Spanish fleets could combine to deliver aid like the aid that was delivered at Yorktown. There was a huge, huge effort. Secondly, the Spanish presence as the major colonial power that was an enemy of the British in the Caribbean was huge, because the Mexican viceroyalty, as it was called then, run by a viceroy in Mexico, produced most of the world's silver at the time. So the silver dollar, that was the Spanish silver dollar, which was called the peso in Spain, was legal currency in North America until 1857. They would grab a Spanish silver dollar and stamp it with the US stamp and call it an American dollar over the Spanish one. So the North American economy was a barter economy. So the fact that silver dollars were available from Cuba, Havana, 60 miles south of Florida, was a huge thing. And not only that, is that Cuba was the biggest colonial military outpost, because every convoy that came with silver from Mexico to Spain stopped in Havana. And Havana was a fortified town. It, in fact, had the only major shipyard in the Caribbean. No other country had a shipyard that built ships of the line and other military ships. So it was like a fully equipped town ready for anything. And it was a huge help, not only from the military point of view, but also because Havana opened its harbor to the North American rebels. And a lot of trade would happen in Havana. Flour, which was not grown so extensively in Cuba and the Spanish colonies, would come from North America and they would sell it for hard currency during the war. And a lot of money was brought back to North American shores because of that.
What was the ratio of the currency between the fledgling United States that was just a few years old and the Spanish dollar?
Well, in fact, in 1778, I think it was, the Continental Congress introduced the Continental dollar. It was a paper dollar. And they started stamping these pieces of paper saying, for every one paper dollar, we will in the future give you, when you hand it over, one silver dollar. But rapidly people became disenchanted with this because it just wasn't happening. So by the time the Yorktown campaign is happening, the ratio is something like one Spanish silver dollar to 12,000 bits of paper that say you will get one silver dollar. It was basically worthless. So the American army was marching on credit, and the Continental Army basically would confiscate supplies, and they would issue promissory notes, uh, in some cases issued by Superintendent of Finance Robert Morris, who was in charge of the finances at that stage, and they would be called long bobs or short bobs after Robert Morris's name, depending on how long he would take to pay you back. So this was how the Continentals marched. They had no money.
And it's interesting how when Hamilton set up a lot of the economy of America, really was a godsend to the people who were in charge of the country at that time. Um,
Yes, and
so,
in fact, Hamilton, I think he used an average. He got together maybe a dozen. I can't remember the amount of Spanish silver dollars or pesos, and he weighed them all up and divided it by 12. This is the average weight because they weren't all exactly the same. And this is how much a United States silver dollar is going to weigh. It's going to be the average of so many Spanish silver pesos divided by the amount. Yeah,
is that right? That's
yeah.
interesting. So, well, how did you become an independent historian? You certainly had a law career. What approach or methodology did you apply to in your research? Because you
Well,
said,
I was a history enthusiast, and eventually I found myself with time about 10 years ago, and I decided to apply for a master's degree in civil. I am actually half Spanish, so I can read and write and do all that stuff in a Spanish university. So during that time, I learned how to research in Seville the Archive of the Indies, which is the main colonial archives. It's where the letters, and I found some very exciting letters, by the way, letters that had been written by George Washington in Morristown, written to the governor of Havana. So when I started to pick up iconic bits of paper like that in my hands, I started to become really absorbed. And gradually, the story of Saavedra, I came across his diaries and other accounts of the war, and I started putting things together. So I finished my master's degree and I just couldn't let it go. So I ended up going to France, to the French Naval Archives, to the diplomatic archives, and and now I have this book published, which has been, for me, a journey.
well, I tell you what, you certainly are passionate about it, and it's great insight and insights that we don't normally have from an American point of view. We're all very egocentric in the way we approach things, and we as Americans would like to think that the revolution began and ended in North America and in those 13 colonies, and that's certainly not the case because Great Britain had a reach all throughout the world. They're you know thinking about India around the same time. They're all over the place.
Yes.
So the fact that you can bring in the Spanish and the French in this and actually back it up with real time research. That is fantastic. But taking that research and turning it into words where the reader can, gain it from not only just an informational standpoint, but from an entertaining standpoint. Tell me a little bit or describe your writing style.
I tried to make the writing of my book as amenable as I could to the general reader, without losing historical accuracy. Because during my initial work years, I was an equities analyst. Um, I was pretty analytical as to what I allowed myself to put in. So everything is based on letters from the French foreign minister, Spanish foreign minister, so historical accuracy is really what it's based on. It's based on Saavedra's diaries and also the letters he wrote back and forth to the various commanders and to Madrid. So that was my biggest thing. But I also had to turn it into a readable book. And it's very difficult to make stodgy old history into something that's readable. Some chapters will read a lot easier, and some just have to deliver the information. So I apologize to anyone that finds some of the chapters good and some less easy to read. But, some of them read really well, like his journeys through Central America. They read like a travel log because he wrote beautifully and described the journeys to Havana, on board the ships, and his journeys through Mexico, like you were reading a travel book.
I'll tell you, I'm very interested in what I've read of the book so far. I am deeply thrilled to hear that part of history and how we tie into Spain, how we tie into Cuba, how we tie into France, and how all of those needed to come together, to make this happen on a permanent basis as far as American independence is concerned. What do you think Americans should learn, or how should they approach alliances, or what did this teach you in regards to alliances that we can apply to today?
Well, the most important point is let's go back to the French and Indian War. The French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War as it's called in Europe, involves the British smacking the pants off the French in North America. They defeat the French Navy. They take all of the North American French territories. The whole Mississippi, or from Canada down to New Orleans, was French up until the end of the French and Indian War. So the French lost all of that. They didn't lose Canada, but they tried. And the French were basically left with a few colonies in the islands of the Caribbean, and what they had in the islands off Nova Scotia. So Britain was victorious. The reason it was victorious is because it had allies. It had allies in Europe that were attacking France by land, and the French weren't able to deploy all of the resources to the British. Now, what happened is the British got super cocky after the second 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, and they started making enemies of everybody. So when the beginning of the Revolutionary War starts, Britain has got no allies on the continent. There is no one to distract the French or the Spanish on the continent of Europe by making a war. So continental powers are able to deploy all of their might to defeat the British. So you might be the biggest. The message is, what I'm trying to say is that you might be the biggest guy in the schoolyard, but if you've got no friends, the rest of the school class is going to take you out because there's just too many. So is it where we are now with North America and the rest of the world? In Europe, we feel sometimes that NATO as an alliance is under threat. Of course, the United States rightfully thinks, and maybe correctly, in many cases, that it's over-contributing to the alliance. But the United States also benefits from the alliance. And in fact, now we have the fraying of the alliance and the United States starting to act more unilaterally, which is the position that Great Britain was in the 1770s in the American Revolutionary War. So that's the message that I would give North America now.
We're coming to the end of our episode here, but let me ask you this. This is a question I ask all my guests. What does freedom mean to James?
Well, freedom is the ability to do as you please on the most elementary level, and I think that is a value that's worth defending. That's a value we have across all our Western countries, and it's probably the most valuable thing that we have of anything in our Western style democracies. So the fact that we enjoy it, we should preserve it. I think on a sideline of that, I think it's slightly sad that nowadays the divisions that are political in all our countries, not just what I see in North America, but also in Europe, that the political divisions are leading people not to be able to debate, not to be able to cross the line and to agree on, we might not agree on everything, but we should be able to agree on some things. So I think freedom must be defended, but unity must also be defended within that freedom.
Outstanding. Tell us the title of your book and how people can get it.
So the book is called Francisco de Saavedra's American Revolutionary War, The Spanish Contribution to the Battle of Yorktown. It's available on Amazon.com and also at all major book retailers.
Well, listen, thank you so much, James. I appreciate you coming on board with us. And I know my listeners will look forward to reading your book. It's really outside of the scope of what we normally think about from the American Revolution. Thank you for bringing it to our attention, and we look forward to reading the book.